Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 55, Nature Part 1. Creativity is allowing yourself to make mistakes. Art is knowing which ones to keep. Scott Adams. Is there any discomfort? Fu's voice had a surprising hint of tenderness as she slowly unwrapped the bandages from around Haku's hands. It had been a daily thing for them for the past week, as she had to constantly reapply light healing salve to aid the restoration of the Hyoten wielder's tenketsu. To his credit though, the dark-haired Yuki didn't even flinch as the last of the clean, white bandages fell from around his fingers. He looked down, expecting to see what he had for the past few days: ugly discoloration and the dark, angry red spots that represented the areas he had nearly blown out his delicate chakra points. It feels okay. And he meant it. After waking up the first day, it had taken a good deal of his self-control not to whimper in pain at the intense burning sensation beneath the skin of his hands. Holding anything had been difficult, and moving his fingers, let alone forming hand seals, had been nearly impossible. Even now he could feel the faint throb that was an ever-present reminder of the damage he had done to himself in their battle with Han. However, compared to that initial burning, it was barely noticeable. Sure enough, when he looked down, the angry red marks had faded and his hands now only bore a faint, unnatural pink hue. In any case, it will take a few more days to fully heal. Haku nodded absently as he experimentally flexed his hands, marveling at how easy it was compared to yesterday. He was still slightly stiff, but that was to be expected after so long without using them. It didn't make it any less uncomfortable though. Thank you, Fu. The girl only nodded in her reserved, quiet way as she stood back up, walking across the clearing to tend to her other patient. Haku watched her go with a small smile. This last week Fu had really showcased her abilities with medical ninjutsu as she cared for both him and Naruto. However, it had also revealed another side of her. He had a feeling the girl enjoyed taking care of them, being the one in charge for once. It didn't matter that Naruto was more powerful than her. What mattered was the fact that right now, in his weakened condition, he was completely reliant on her care. However, it was obvious that was coming to an end. With every day, Naruto's remarkable healing abilities fixed his wrecked chakra system. Even now the pallid sheen on his skin had vanished and it no longer pained. Recently he had even garnered the ability to walk again without wincing every step. It had only sped up once he had been able to channel chakra to some extent again and was able to use his own impressive skill with medical ninjutsu to aid his recovery. It made Haku long for when they began to teach him in earnest. He wished to heal people like they could. How are you feeling? Fu blinked in surprise when a moment passed and Naruto didn't answer. He was sat against a tree, staring off into the forest with a far-off expression. She sat down next to him curiously, knowing that he wasn't meditating as he took a specific position for that. Naruto. The young monk blinked suddenly as he looked around, as if he genuinely hadn't noticed Fu's approach. She understood it must be quite disconcerting for him to be so injured. He was probably so used to his extended range of vision through the water in the air that going without it made him feel blind. Oh, sorry, I was thinking about something. Fu smiled lightly. It had been amazing how much the two of them had spoken over the past week. It wasn't about anything in particular, but with little else to do as the two boys recovered, talking was the only thing they could do. She felt oddly light and airy as she had allowed herself to talk about anything that came to mind. From her observations from their travels to private little thoughts she had never shared with anyone before. At the same time, she had been allowed a glimpse into just what was going through Naruto's mind, and it somehow only made her more enraptured with the enigma that was the blonde monk. A Rio for your thoughts. Naruto gave a small smile of his own at that as he allowed his head to roll back and rest against the tree. I've just been thinking of how long it's been since I was home. He sighed and looked off in a seemingly random direction, however Fu knew better. These were the woods Naruto had grown up surrounded by, and out of their group he knew them best. That was mostly likely the direction of the fire temple. It's so close now. He let out a small chuckle and returned to staring up through the canopy of the forest to the blue sky high above them. How long has it actually been? Fu was a little surprised. She had never asked before, it had just never come up in conversation. All she knew was that Shizuku had been traveling with him for longer than her, and before that he had briefly traveled alone. Naruto looked down in thought. There had been the months in Suna, the time traveling through the smaller countries where he met Shizuku and Fu, the months they spent in Kumogakure, their time in Mizu no Kuni aiding the resistance, and the year spent traveling with Tsunade. He was 13 now, nearing his 14th birthday. He had left when he was only 11. Around 2.5 years. Fu actually widened her eyes in surprise. While it was true she had never really had a place she could definitively call her home, at least in the sentimental sense of the word, but she at least had an approximation of the feeling traveling with Naruto. To be apart from that for such a time was a hard concept for her to think about. That must be difficult. Naruto nodded slowly, his expression becoming distant again. Why not go back? One of his eyebrows rose in surprise as Fu blinked at her own statement. She wasn't sure why she had said that. She wasn't entirely sure what would happen if Naruto returned to the fire temple. Would he stay? Would Fu be allowed to stay with him? Once again she realized how little she actually knew of Naruto's life before he set out on his pilgrimage. After all, it was what came after he started that was more important to her. I don't even know. I suppose there's nothing saying monks can't return before their journey is over. He sighed lightly as he fell forward, resting his arms on his knees to look at the ground. It's just, I don't feel like I've accomplished what I set out to do. How can I go back knowing that? Fu sat in silence with him for a while, only the gentle ambient noises of the forest breaking up the stillness. Even Haku didn't make a sound. He was spending his time how he always had during the past week, reading medical scrolls that Naruto and Fu still had left over from their training with Tsunade. What was it you wanted to do? Naruto finally looked up and simply stared at Fu for a moment, his rippled eyes meeting her orange ones. I wanted to understand chakra. Fu said nothing to that, just silently absorbing it as she most often did. However, internally it had her greatly surprised. Chakra was everything in the shinobi world. It made up their lives, their professions, their amazing abilities. Yet how many of them had stopped to really think about what it was exactly that drove their impressive jutsu? Sure, they knew it was the combination of physical and spiritual energies, but there were few that didn't know just remedial information. To actually undertake the task of coming to understand such a mysterious and barely understood energy was daunting to anyone, never mind a young child only just venturing out into the world. What makes you think you haven't made progress? This was the first Fu had heard of Naruto's goal, his true goal that had driven him into the wide world in the first place. The blonde looked up, genuinely curious about what his friend meant. What do you mean? Fu smiled, catching Naruto slightly off guard with the warm expression. It was true she had opened up more in the past week, however it was rare to see her simply smile, seemingly for no reason. She leaned forward, taking Naruto's hands lightly in her own and turned them over so his palms faced up. You have mastered all 5 of the elemental natures, who else can say that? Naruto shrugged lamely. That was simply learning to do something with his chakra, not inherently understanding it, although he had come to realize that chakra could behave in any way that his will could bend it to. You created a technique that can bend light using chakra as a medium. A frown appeared on the boy's face at that. It had been a long period of trial and error to discover that chakra had that property, but in the end he supposed he had learned something about it. I don't see. Fu surprised Naruto again by placing a finger on his lips, cutting him off as her look became intense. Normally he was the one capturing people with his powerful gaze, however right now he couldn't tear his own away from those deep, vibrant orange orbs. You are able to create anything from nothing simply with your chakra. That alone is something nobody else in the world can say. She couldn't strictly know that to be true, but at least from what the Kyuubi had told him he knew that it was an ability exclusive to the Sage of the Six Paths, and subsequently Rinnegan users. A smile crossed Naruto's face as he pushed off the ground, standing up to his full height, feeling a little better about himself. Thanks Fu. Her own smile brightened at that. Naruto wasn't exactly loath to hand out compliments or thanks, but it made them no less special for her to hear. She would be the first to admit that she craved acceptance and attention after her treatment in Takigakure, but even then there was just something special about the attention Naruto gave her, something difficult for the emotionally stunted Jinchuriki to explain, even to herself. It's no problem. The blonde just let out a small chuckle before surprising her, moving in close and wrapping his arms around her smaller body in a warm, comforting embrace. No really, I'll always be happy when you're there to pick me up out of my lowest times. The mint-haired girl had no answer for that as a blush crept along her face that she was valiantly, but fruitlessly fighting against. Luckily for her, when Naruto finally let go of her, he seemed distracted and she was able to turn away and hide the pink staining her cheeks. We should probably start to get ready to move. Fu finally managed to get a handle on her own expression in time to look up in confusion. The group had recovered but they were still weak. Where are we going? Naruto just turned and gave her a dazzling smile, somehow made even more radiant by the slight glow to his eyes. I feel homesick and there are some people I really want you to meet. Naruto couldn't properly express the feelings that welled up inside him as the wayward trio crested a hill only to finally spot the high walls of the fire temple through the trees. The familiar steel gates with their imposing and intricate designs standing strong against the greens and browns of the forestry. Fu walked by his side, a soft but still shrewd expression on her face as her friend's home finally came into view. Haku trailed slightly behind them. He hadn't been a part of the group for very long and for some reason he felt slightly out of place being brought here, as if he hadn't earned it yet. As they drew closer, the two gates did their job, humbling weary travelers with the enormous statues of Tengu and Yamabushi, their faces covered by intimidating Oni masks. Naruto remembered when Chiraku had first explained the normally rather intimidating statues to a much younger, more curious Naruto. They were some of the very first practitioners of Ninsho, or what would come to be called ninjutsu. It had been them that had set up the fire temple in the first place to hone their art while at the same time inviting anybody to come and learn with them, a policy the temple maintained to this day. The young monk didn't have to lay a single hand on the impeccable polished ornate door that belied its sturdiness. Nothing short of the most powerful shinobi could ever hope to breach the sealing jutsu on that auspicious gate. It simply swung open almost silently, only the heavily muffled noises of the equally large mechanisms designed to operate the gates reverberating through the surrounding walls. However, the monk that poked his head around the edge had no such reservations regarding the noise he made. Naruto grinned. It seemed even under his Sugagasa his wild blonde hair was easily recognizable to the people that had practically been his surrogate family for 4 years. Although he had to wonder what the chance was that this particular monk had been on gate duty on this very day. Hi Sora. It's been. Naruto's rippled eyes widened slightly as he was forced to bend his body at a rather unnatural angle to move out the way of a flying fist, courtesy of his oldest friend. He was more prepared for the follow-up as a tendril of sand easily broke through the ground, acting as a barrier that Sora sunk his fist into. The darker-haired monk's eyes widened in surprise at the new ability Naruto showed before a very familiar and challenging smirk appeared on his face. It seems you grew even stronger in your time away, Naruto. Impressively fast Sora pulled his hand out of the tightening sand, confusing Naruto as to how until he saw the thin and razor-sharp coating of wind chakra around the boy's fist. But so did I. You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this. However, before he could even move another step, the cold touch of a steel kunai found its way to his throat, making him involuntarily gulp as he looked around to see the previously ignored green-haired girl that had been standing by Naruto's side. He hadn't even seen her move. Hey, you made some new friends too, huh? He smiled weakly as Fu's cold gaze drilled into him. It was as if she were looking past him entirely, as if his existence were no harder to snuff out than it was for her to breathe. Fu, it's all right. Sora's just a little hot-headed. Just like that it was gone, the kunai, the gaze, Fu herself. However, this time the dark-haired monk was paying attention and managed to spot the Jinchuriki flicker back to Naruto's side. Finally allowed to breathe without the fear of slicing open his own throat, Sora managed to slap a large grin on his face as he looked across at his wayward friend. It really has been a while, Naruto, we might as well go in now. I'm pretty sure Chiriku-senpai will come to check out the chakra we were throwing around. The blonde nodded with his own smile splitting his face. He might have been surprised by the unexpected welcome from Sora, but that was just Sora. He trio followed the other monk inside the gates, watching as the enormous doors swung close with a resounding and oddly comforting clang. They turned their attention to the temple itself, and Haku and Fu had to say they were impressed. However, to Naruto it was a whole different story. A multitude of warm feelings filled him as the nostalgia took hold. In reality, he supposed that 2 years really wasn't all that long in the grand scheme of things, but to finally be back gave him a sense of deep relief. "Ah, Naruto, I had wondered when you would return to us." If anything, Naruto's smile managed to grow even larger as he turned to the familiar, elderly voice that had appeared behind them. "Chukaku Shisho." The elderly head monk chuckled warmly as one of his favorite young students wrapped his arms around him in a quick embrace. He actually managed to raise a furry eyebrow at the fact Naruto was starting to encroach on him height-wise. "You've gotten a lot taller, my boy." Naruto simply grinned at the sort of compliment as Chukaku made a general sweeping motion to the main building of the temple where his study was. "Come now, I'm sure you have a great many stories to tell us about your travels, so we'll all go inside and have some tea." The man smiled warmly at the two young teens accompanying Naruto in the squinting manner that had them realize where Naruto had gotten his patented look from. "I'm sure your friends will be most comfortable with the Fire Temple's hospitality." A mischievous glint entered the man's narrowed eyes that anybody in the temple would have been able to recognize. "I made the tea myself, you know." For some reason his gaze was firmly on Fu when he said that. Naruto just sighed, wondering why all of the people he felt he could respect in this world just happened to be closet perverts, not that he could get any evidence on his wily Shisho. "Come now, the tea's cooling. So how did you guys meet Naruto?" Sora walked between Haku and Fu as he guided them about the temple. Chukaku and Naruto were discussing something in private and the elderly head monk had suggested taking the two on a tour. Sora was a little annoyed as he hadn't been able to see his best friend in 2 years, but if he was asked of something by the head monk he could hardly refuse, plus he was sure he would get time with Naruto later. "I have actually only recently come to know Naruto." The young monk looked around at the one he had come to know was called Haku. Normally Sora wouldn't think of himself as petty, but when he saw another guy around Naruto he became weary. Sora had a rather isolated childhood due to what he had possessed, much like Naruto himself, and the thought of his best friend forgetting about him worried him far more than he would ever admit. "He allowed me to accompany him after I lost somebody very precious to me." Sora felt a little bit of the tension drain away at that. Now that did sound like Naruto. The blonde was sometimes too caring and compassionate for his own good. "What about you?" Sora was still a little unnerved by the quiet girl that trailed behind them slightly. She hadn't said barely a word since entering the temple with Naruto, and so far the only interaction between them had been her holding a kunai to his throat. From what he had seen so far she seemed like a shinobi. Both of them did in fact, hardly the people he would have expected Naruto to befriend. However, he trusted his friend's judgment. Naruto just had the ability to see and bring out the good in almost anybody he met given enough time. "Naruto rescued me." Sora paused, expecting more. When it didn't, he just smiled awkwardly and started walking again, occasionally pointing out something worth viewing in the temple. Fu just continued to walk along in silence. She had considered telling Sora about the fact she was a Jinchuriki. She knew about his previous situation from Naruto after all. However, she still didn't feel comfortable with it. She was getting better at opening up to people, but she just couldn't befriend people the way Naruto could. Her trust was more difficult to obtain. Right now only 6 or 7 people in the world outside of her village knew that she was a Jinchuriki: Naruto, Haku, Tsunade, Shizune, Kurabi and Roshi, Hantu if he was still alive. She listened absently to Sora comment on various things in the temple, but her mind was elsewhere. She was worried about Naruto, or more specifically she was worried about what was going to happen between them. Would Naruto now stay in the temple? Would this be where their paths parted? Fu sincerely hoped that wasn't true. "Your story fills me with happiness and sadness at the same time, Naruto." The young blonde and the much more elderly head monk were sat in his study. Naruto had finished recounting his story to the man and he had simply sat there in silence, taking it all in, before now. When I allowed you to walk out of those gates and back into the world again, I knew your travels would be eventful, however I had never expected anything like this." Naruto just nodded slowly. He had been the one to live it, but to recount his own travels, even he had to admit his story was somewhat fantastical. He had left nothing out. If there was anybody he felt he could trust unconditionally, it was Chukaku. "It warms my heart to see you with such strong, dependable friends and to know you have touched the lives of so many." A kindly smile spread across his wrinkled features before it slipped away as some of the darker moments from Naruto's tale entered his thoughts. "And again it fills it with dread knowing what you have had to go through even in your short life." Truly he believed that nobody Naruto's age should have ever had to face the things the young Rinnegan wielder had. "It's okay." Naruto's voice carried none of the usually confidence he showed to others. Now that he was back home, he felt no need to maintain that strong outer appearance he had been bearing for so long. If anything, his voice finally started to betray the sheer exhaustion he felt from it all. As powerful as he was still only 13 years old. "I've had time to come to terms with it all, even Shizuku's death." Chukaku nearly winced at that. He had felt the sheer emotion in the boy's voice when he spoke of the young girl he had found, befriended, loved and lost in the span of a year. "Still, an enormous burden was placed upon your shoulders when you activated those eyes of yours." His smile returned and became as encouraging as he could manage. No matter what changed, he would always remember that little half-starved boy that had wound up on their doorstep with nothing but the clothes on his back and an inquisitive mind. "I'm proud about the things you've accomplished, Naruto." His smile became a little more mischievous, more the way Naruto actually remembered the old man. "Maybe later you could give me a little demonstration of your newfound abilities. Sora often speaks of when you would return so the two of you could spar." A smile of his own appeared on the blonde's face at that. It seemed Sora hadn't changed all that much in his time away. "Now Naruto, if I may ask," the younger monk looked up, noting some of the playfulness had left the elderly man's voice as concern entered his eyes. "It didn't seem like you felt your journey was over yet. What made you return to us so soon?" Upon Naruto raising an eyebrow, the man coughed before elaborating. "Not that I'm not pleased to have you back, you know." Naruto just chuckled. He was glad for that. Some of the stress he had been feeling just seemed to melt away the more he talked with his shisho. "Honestly, I was talked into it." Chukaku raised an amused eyebrow before Naruto continued. "But I did feel homesick. I just needed a little push to admit it to myself." The blonde sighed as he looked up at the ceiling of the study. "But now that I'm actually here, I have to admit that there's something I need help with." Chukaku raised another furry eyebrow, however this time in intrigue. The problems Naruto brought to him were often the most interesting. "Do tell." Fu seriously found her interest waning as the tour wound to a close. She had learned a lot about where Naruto had lived for a large part of his life, but when it came down to it, it was a temple. It was a very large and prestigious temple with more monks than many smaller villages had people, but it was still a temple. She had stayed at quite a few traveling with Naruto, and once you had seen one you really understood them all. There were places of mediation and training, places to eat and places to sleep, and that was basically it. However, her interest peaked again when they rounded a corner into a large, serene-looking field near the center of the compound. The group spotted Naruto and Chukaku sitting out on the grass, near to a statue of what appeared to be a monk in meditation. As they walked closer, Fu actually found her attention drifting to the statue. The detail on it was absolutely remarkable. It was as if somebody had simply captured a moment in time and frozen it in stone. However, she quickly forgot about it at the croaky sound of Chukaku's voice. "Ah, you're here. I wondered how long we would have to wait for you to join us." Sora lifted an arm up to scratch the back of his head with a sheepish smile, chuckling slightly. "Sorry Shisho, I guess the time got away from me." The elderly monk waved the boy off as he beckoned for the group to join them on the grass. "No matter, I was just about to begin explaining things to young Naruto here." Fu took the opportunity to sit next to her blonde friend, Sora quickly taking the other side before Haku had the chance. The ice wielder was perfectly fine with sitting next to the more elderly monk though, after all he was still new to the group. "What were you explaining?" Sora actually blinked in shock as Fu spoke up. That was more than she had said with him, and she hadn't even been prompted to speak. "Naruto asked me about something that at the time he left, still confused even me." He motioned to the dark-haired monk absently. Sora already knows this, but has Naruto ever explained to you what exactly he sees through those remarkable eyes of his? Fu nodded slowly. She had a vague idea, but the concept itself was hard to wrap her head around, actually seeing chakra in all its colors and forms. It just sounded fantastical, not that she didn't believe him. Haku on the other hand had no idea other than he could somehow see chakra and shook his head in the negative. Well, Naruto-kun can actually glimpse at what others could only dream of knowing about, the very appearance and nature of chakra itself. Haku's eyes widened just slightly at that. He hadn't realized the ability was so extensive. However, near to when he first joined us at the temple, he observed a strange, translucent glow to everything that he could neither feel nor could his prada path interact with, which at first led me to believe it was not in fact chakra. At this even Naruto started to avidly pay attention. This was partly why he had come after all. However, after Naruto left on his pilgrimage, I became curious once more and began looking through our archives. He gave a small smile to Naruto, knowing that the blonde had tried the same, however there were things he just couldn't access at that age. I believe that what Naruto was viewing was nature chakra. At that all four teens blinked in confusion, never having heard the term before, at least not in any more than passing. Nature chakra. As in chakra that doesn't come from humans. Chukaku's eyes twinkled slightly as he saw some of that original inquisitive nature of Naruto's shine through with his question. Actually, as far as I can tell, it does come from humans, however it also comes from everything else. Plants, animals, even the ground itself contribute to the nature chakra that permeates our world. It's the chakra of the world itself. For the most part it goes unnoticed, however there are those that know of its existence and even are able to interact with it. He paused a moment to allow that to sink in, also because he had a bit of a dramatic flair and he enjoyed the tension in the air. Those select few, were known as sages. At that all of the teens were shocked, however none more so than Naruto, whose rippled eyes opened wide in realization, something the elderly monk didn't miss. That's right, Naruto, the sage of the six paths was also able to manipulate nature chakra. It's no wonder either if he had the ability to see it like you can. Naruto nodded concedingly at that, wondering if, given enough time, he would have discovered this for himself. So how is it done, manipulating nature chakra? Chukaku smiled at Naruto sadly as his gaze drifted to the statue of the monk, bringing their own gazes with him. I'm afraid that knowledge was lost to us with Monk Gyatso. He was the last of us to ever attempt to harness nature chakra according to the records. Naruto gazed at the statue a moment, marveling at the amazing likeness it portrayed. The detail really was exquisite. What happened to him? Chukaku's smile twinged down even further at that, his eyes never leaving the statue as if for the first time he was truly seeing it. Nothing, he's sitting right in front of you. After a moment of pause to allow that to sink in fully, all four teens visibly recoiled from the statue in realization. That's him. But he's a statue. Chukaku's gaze became stern as he looked around, a look that didn't often enter his features. Please Sora, respect. The darker-haired monk became quiet at that as Chukaku looked around again, finding Naruto alternating between him and the statue with a questioning glance. Nature chakra, it seems, is a double-edged blade. On one hand, the sages of legend and even those of today were renowned for their enormous strength and power. On the other, the training itself is dangerous and oftentimes, lethal. Naruto's questioning look became a frown as he continued to stare at the statue, as if scrutinizing every inch. The sages of today. Naruto looked up in surprise at Fu's voice, picking out a detail he had missed. Chukaku simply nodded. Oh yes, while a rare and powerful ability, there are still those that practice senjutsu. However, the ability is a closely guarded secret, mostly passed down from certain summoning animals to their contract holders. The only thing I know about the practice is that it involves being still. Naruto blinked slowly as he finally tore his gaze from the petrified monk, forever frozen in the picture of serenity. He remembered this statue. He had walked past it day in and day out for 4 years without thinking anything of it, and all this time it had once been a living, breathing human. How is that any different from the meditation we do? I remember being still for 3 days straight to win a bet with Sora. Chukaku gained a bit of mirth in his eyes as he too recollected that particular event. It had actually snowed on one of the days, but Naruto never once moved. No, my boy, what I'm talking about here is being truly still, perfectly in balance with nature and your surroundings. He sighed a moment, for a brief moment actually showing his many years he kept hidden behind a youthful, mischievous veil. However, Naruto became confused. He was unsure how he could possibly be any stiller than he was during meditation. Aren't there any faster ways? Once again Chukaku gazed at Sora sternly. Without Naruto around to siphon off some of his excess energy, he had become quite outspoken over the past years. There are no shortcuts on the paths to enlightenment, Sora. However, that stern gaze melted away as he looked up at the sky thoughtfully for a moment. However, now you mention it, from the limited information in the archives, it would seem that this training becomes easier in places with strong connections to nature such as Myobokuzen, Ryuchi Cave and Shikatsu Forest. Fu frowned at that. She prided herself on knowing most of the elemental nations off by heart, however she had never heard of those places. Don't fret, girl. She looked up to see Chukaku smiling at her kindly. I would not expect you to have heard of the summoning realms, for Konoha's 3 great summoning contracts. Fu's eyes widened in understanding, but she said nothing. Without a contract, those places were completely inaccessible anyway, or at least extremely well hidden. But then what is the problem? All eyes turned back to Naruto as he gestured around him to the temple, or more specifically the forest beyond. How much deeper in nature would we be in the forests of Hi-no-Kuni? For emphasis he lightly gestured to the petrified monk statue. If Gyatso could do it here, then theoretically it was suitable, even if he failed for whatever reason. Chukaku on the other hand simply shook his head slowly. I'm afraid that while once these forests might have been perfect for sage training, that is no longer the case. These forests around us are a result of Hashirama Senju's powerful Mokudan abilities. They are not natural at all. Gyatso predates even those times, back to the warring clans period. Whatever conditions existed then are vastly different than today. They are no longer suitable. Naruto's face fell slightly at the news, however he did not allow himself to be disheartened. Then I will have to find somewhere that is. Chukaku grinned at the steely confidence radiating from the young blonde. He truly was an indomitable spirit. I'm sure you will, boy, but now you must be weary from your travels. You and your friends are more than welcome to stay with us for as long as you require. Naruto's face softened into a light smile as he inclined his head at the older monk. Thank you, Shisho, I'm grateful. Chukaku just waved him up as the blonde stood. He was feeling tired now and some rest would be appreciated. As Sora led him, Fu and Haku away, Chukaku watched them leave with a small sigh. You are truly destined for great things, Naruto Uzumaki. This temple won't constrain you forever. I just ask that you humor an old man in his twilight hours. With that the old monk stood, groaning at his creaking limbs. He wondered how Sarutobi could possibly be so old and still be a shinobi. Chapter 56, Nature Part 2. Maybe I got something wrong, but it doesn't matter because the thought of wanting to help others definitely isn't wrong. Shuru Emiya. The full moon hung low in the sky as Naruto made his way up to the roof where he knew he would find Sora. Sure enough, the boy was sitting there on the tiles, staring up at the bright white orb suspended in the sky as they used to do before Naruto left. He looked around when Naruto's feet made a soft whisper against the tiles but said nothing, returning his steady gaze to the sky as Naruto walked over and sat beside his longtime friend. So you're really leaving again, so soon? It had been 2 weeks since Naruto, Haku, and Fu had arrived at the Fire Temple, enough time for them to fully recuperate and enjoy a brief moment of peace before moving on. Naruto had decided that they would leave tomorrow, starting on what many would consider a pointless and vain quest to discover the secrets of nature chakra and senjutsu. Yeah. Silence hung in the air between the two friends as Naruto joined Sora in turning his gaze up to the sky. We did this the last time I left too, didn't we? Just sit up here all night. A faint nostalgic smile appeared on Sora's face at that as he leant back on his elbows. Yeah, back then I had no idea when you would be back either. I kept asking myself if I could go along with you, join you on whatever it was you were going to do. He sighed, dropping his gaze from the sky as Naruto turned to look at him. Why didn't you? Sora gave a half-hearted smile, but he could tell Naruto's question was sincere. The blonde would have loved to have Sora join him traveling. However, at the same time, who was to say things would have happened the same way? Would he have still met Shizuku? Fu? Haku? Would he have gathered the Biju or made as much headway with the Kyuubi as he had? He didn't know. I'm not as powerful as you, Naruto, we both know that. His voice didn't sound all that sad about it. Simply resigned. He knew it too as not too soon after Naruto had come back the two had sparred, properly this time and without Fu's interference. Sora had really taken shadow clone training to heart in Naruto's time away, clocking away far more training than the 2 years should have allowed. However, even with the initial boost being a pseudo-Jinchuriki gave him and those countless hours training and the subsequent headaches that came with it, he just could find himself competing with the Rinnegan bearer. Sora panted lightly, standing at the center of a large crater in a forest clearing some ways out from the temple itself. When a full spar had been suggested, Chiriku had been very insistent that they do it somewhere the collateral damage, and there would be damage, would be minimized. He felt lucky, had he not been a pseudo-Jinchuriki and gained the immense stamina and chakra reserves that came with it, he was sure he would be completely out of it from chakra exhaustion. As it was, he only felt slightly winded, enough to debilitate but not to cripple. "How are you feeling?" The same apparently couldn't be said for his opponent. Naruto stood across from him, apparently completely unscathed or tired in the least. Sora growled lightly, a habit he had never quite gotten rid of in his fighting, and simply rushed forward. While he knew there was no condescension in his friend's voice, it still infuriated him that after all this time, after all his training, he still couldn't hold a candle to Naruto. Juaha Repu Sho. He felt his chakra flood his right arm as he converted its nature to wind, carefully controlling the dangerous and violent element. It took form in front of him as a great, demonic claw of pure wind that writhed about as if it had a mind of his own. Then, with an enormous grunt of effort, he sent the giant, lethal claw flying forwards, directly at his blonde friend. However, much to his consternation, he saw that Naruto wasn't making an effort to dodge, or block, or do anything. "Come on, Sora, haven't you learned by now?" Naruto raised a hand and Sora watched hopelessly as one of his most powerful wind attacks dwindled away to a harmless gust of air that was just as quickly snuffed out. He sighed as his body slumped back, finally starting to feel the dent all of this was putting on his reserves. He knew of his friend's Preta path, however he had hoped that his jutsu was powerful enough to at least cause a few scratches even if it ultimately was absorbed. However, he couldn't continue with this. With every jutsu he launched, Naruto's own chakra supply only grew off of his own. "It's not over yet, Naruto." As if to affirm his point, 10 different Soras suddenly sprung from the shadows the trees provided. The darker-haired monk shrugged of the fact his blonde opponent didn't seem the least bit surprised and joined his shadow clones as each donned 2 wicked-looking gauntlets of wind, taking on the same demonic visage as the last jutsu. Juaha Sho Renden. Naruto observed quietly as the many different Soras approached him on all sides at incredible speed. It's still not enough. Naruto couldn't allow Sora to get close to him. The darker-haired monk had already proven his taijutsu was something to be feared. Like Naruto, he used his wind element to augment his movements. However, instead of blasting it out of his tenketsu for increased speed, he carefully manipulated the air around him to drastically lower the air resistance on his body, giving him incredible maneuverability. Naruto couldn't allow him to get close, so he did the one thing that came perfectly naturally to him, raising his hands up in a way that Sora instantly recognized. Shinra Tensai. However, Naruto could help but show his shock as instead of being blasted back by the technique, the Sora clones sailed through the chakra pulse as if it had never happened. "You think I've just been doing nothing all these years, Naruto?" Naruto had time to widen his eyes imperceptibly as he jumped back from the first clone, almost instinctively slipping into Mizu no Mai to dodge. He had found out the hard way that using his Kase no Mai only added fuel to Sora's techniques and his Kaminari no Mai had the elemental disadvantage. He refused to use his Hai no Mai though, that was only for use against opponents and was his only truly lethal taijutsu form. However, as good as he was at dodging with this style, Sora just proved to be faster, obviously not having wasted his 2 years to prepare for this. Naruto was driven back by the barrage of clones and their dangerous wind jutsu, occasionally managing to grab one to drain it of chakra, however another would just take its place. Finally he had enough as his hand clenched, a large wave of sand exploding from the ground and instantly capturing all of the clones with only the original Sora jumping back in time. That was a nice try, Sora, but it's still not enough. Strangely though, Sora's grin didn't deteriorate in the least, putting Naruto rightfully on edge. "It's not over yet, Naruto." The blonde's eyes widened again as 4 more clones sprung from the earth around him, hidden from his sensing technique by hiding underground. However, they didn't attack, and before Naruto could even do anything, they ran through a complicated chain of hand signs in perfect unison befitting of clones. Finally they slammed their hands down, allowing long and even more complicated strings of kanji to unfurl from their palms to surround Naruto in a perfect square, crying out in perfect synchronization. Fuinjutsu. Shishienjin. Instantly the kanji glowed a dangerous red as 4 walls of bright red flame sprang up, quickly enclosing Naruto as a roof formed over the barrier jutsu as well. A small smirk crossed his lips briefly as he recognized it as a seemingly more powerful version of the one Orochimaru had used to try and seal in the Kage and Hokage. This is very impressive, Sora. I hadn't realized you had advanced so far in Fuinjutsu. Sora smiled from outside of the barrier. It was clear enough for them to see each other through the flickers of the chakra-controlled flames. You have no idea, Naruto. The blonde just nodded, inwardly both proud and impressed of how much Sora had advanced. How did you nullify my Shinra Tensei? Naruto was genuinely curious about that. It had been the first ability he had developed from his Rinnegan, so naturally Sora knew of it and had come up with ways to best it in the past, but nothing like this. At that, Sora grinned proudly. That was one of his proudest achievements. Naruto's Diva Path had always been the deciding factor in their spars 2.5 years ago, even after the Preta Path manifested. I took a gravity seal and modified it so that it reacts to changes in pressure on my body, adjusting accordingly. If the gravity on my body changes, it activates, resetting it to what it should be. It doesn't matter the direction or the power behind it. Naruto had to let out a small smile at that. It really was ingenious. In that way the monk had managed to completely nullify his Diva Path, although the claims about it being able to handle any amount of power remained to be seen. You really have come a long way. Sora's grin slipped into a frown as Naruto walked forward, passing through his barrier as if it was no more troublesome than normal air. He groaned, sinking to a knee as the chakra exhaustion finally caught up to him. That barrier had been his trump card. He didn't have anything else, at least nothing he could use to beat Naruto anymore. He blinked though when a hand on his shoulder steadied him, bringing him back to his feet. I'm still behind you. He said it under his breath, barely a whisper. Naruto picked it up anyway. He didn't say anything though, just smiling lightly as the two friends walked back towards the temple. And what about now? Sora looked around at Naruto as the blonde looked at him questioningly, his violet eyes carefully gauging his friend. Do you want to come with me? Sora blinked at that before looking away, staring at the tiles in front of him as if they would suddenly unfurl and reveal the answer to him. However, no such miracle took place and he was left to sort out his own thoughts into an answer. Did he want to go with Naruto? Of course he wanted to go with his friend, the first boy that had looked past the demon inside of him and befriend him. He loved Naruto like a brother, but looking at him now, older, wiser, more powerful than ever before, he sighed. Naruto had his own life, he had new friends. Even if he said Sora would always be his first, he knew it was still true. If Sora went with his friend, he knew he would be happy, content even. However, Sora didn't want to just be content. He didn't want to forever trail in the great shadow Naruto cast, as selfish as that seemed. No. Naruto's face fell a little. He understood Sora's choice, but that didn't make him any less upset about it. I couldn't do that to myself. Naruto looked back up, a little surprised to see the slight grin pulling at Sora's lips as the boy gazed up at the moon. You're strong, Naruto, way stronger than I am, and you probably always will be. He looked around, capturing Naruto in an oddly powerful gaze, the steel in his eyes practically radiating out from him. I want what you have, a life outside these walls of my own. If I went with you, I would just drag you down, hold you back. Before Naruto could protest that, Sora held up a hand, silencing him for the moment as his gaze softened. It doesn't matter if you don't agree, I know it, and that's enough. He stood up on the roof, gazing out at the temple that had been his life, practically his whole world for the first 13 years of his life. I'm always going to be grateful you were my friend and that you were there so that I could better myself with you as the unattainable goal. He grinned as Naruto stood up as well, a little more hesitantly though as he gazed curiously at his friend. So when you go tomorrow, I'll be following you out of those gates, but I'll be going my own direction. I think it's time for me to find something new. He stopped, pausing to see Naruto's reaction. However, instead of the protests he had expected, or even the denial of some of his points. He only found Naruto to be smiling slightly sadly. "You're still just as hot-headed as ever, you know that, right?" Sora just grinned enthusiastically, the feeling becoming infections as a warmer smile tugged at the blonde's features. "I hope you find what you're looking for, I really do." Sora nodded briefly in thanks for the sentiment, but his gaze became confused as Naruto clasped his hands together, one burning a vibrant red, the other a much colder blue. When he opened them again, a single white Magatama bead, exactly the same as his earring, lay in his hands. When Sora looked up questioningly, Naruto simply held the bead out and dropped it into the boy's palm. "I figured I should return the favor, for good luck." Sora looked down at the innocuous little bead in his hand that moments ago had been nothing but the chakra running through Naruto's body. Finally a warm smile encroached on his face as his hand tightened around the present. "Thank you, Naruto." Naruto simply returned the gesture, patting the dark-haired monk on the back lightly. "Whatever happens on my journey, or yours, we'll still be friends." Sora just gave a single affirmative nod before the two boys sat back down on the rooftop, content to simply look up at the moon, hanging sentinel in the sky above them. Once again Naruto and his two companions found themselves wandering, almost aimlessly, through the expansive forests of High no Kuni. They had left the temple the previous day, Sora hot on their heels even if he had been headed in a different direction. Something told Naruto that he would see his first friend again, their paths were irrevocably interwoven now. Sora hadn't really stated where he was planning on going, but Naruto could imagine him now, wandering cluelessly through the world, much like they were now. "So where's our first stop?" Naruto didn't look back at Fu as they continued walking, but the girl did quicken her pace slightly so she strode along next to him. "I haven't really decided yet." Fu nodded somewhat understandingly. Naruto had undertaken a massive task in trying to unravel the intricacies of senjutsu without any kind of help. It was understandable that finding a starting point for such a quest, for lack of a better word, would be difficult. "We should focus on areas with large expanses of forestry." Naruto nodded to that as Haku joined them by taking up Naruto's other side. As nervous as the boy had been coming into a place that was obviously so important to Naruto, he had felt as though he really learned something about the blonde Jinchuriki, feeling more like a part of the group as a result. It would seem places like Kusa no Kuni, Tani no Kuni, Kawa no Kuni and Cha no Kuni would be the best places to start. Again Naruto nodded as Fu offered another insight, he had been thinking much the same. However, Tani no Kuni was out of the question, he wouldn't put Fu in danger by bringing her so close to her previous home again. However, Kusa no Kuni definitely seemed like a good place to start. After all, he had passed through there once before and there was a vast amount of strange and exotic forestry as well as wildlife to constitute nature chakra. "I think we should start in Kusa no Kuni." He paused a moment, not breaking his stride, as he waited for any kind of argument from his friends. When it didn't come, he smiled. He genuinely enjoyed having people around him that trusted his judgment like this and were willing to follow his lead because of the trust they had in him. In that vein, he subtly altered the path they were walking in until they were headed northwest. They were in the eastern region of High no Kuni and their path would take them up and north of Konoha. They didn't need another encounter with Leaf Shinobi so soon. However, after a few hours of walking interspersed with the occasional light conversation, Naruto's normally serene features pulled down into a half frown as his gaze kept pulling off to their left. It was just outside the range of his sensory vision, but he could still notice it, the copious amounts of chakra being thrown around. From the way Fu kept shooting discreet looks in the same direction, she had noticed it too, as did Haku. "Should we ignore it? It's most likely a battle between shinobi." Naruto frowned. That was exactly the problem. Shinobi battles were messy and they often left either casualties or opponents with terrible injuries. His preservation instincts were screaming for him to ignore it and carry on. This deep in High no Kuni territory, one of the sides was likely to be Konoha. However, the part of him that was a medic, practically beaten into him by Tsunade, screamed equally loud that he had a responsibility to make sure that any injured parties received the appropriate care. "No, we'll go and at least see what's happening." He didn't get any protests from the two, but Fu's eyes narrowed slightly at that. She cared little for the conflicts of shinobi, and with the ingrained killer instincts from her previous life, it was a whole lot easier for her to ignore her conscience and those same instincts driving Naruto to go and help. However, she would wordlessly follow Naruto because that was the path she had chosen. She was committed to that. It didn't take them all that long to reach the first signs of battle, although worryingly they seemed to stretch in an almost straight line from the north heading towards Konoha. If they lingered for too long, either those responsible or the team Konoha would undoubtedly send would find them. However, in that time the fighting had obviously stopped, only the lingering chakra in the air indicating there had been conflict at all, that, and the enormous forest of bones the trio came across. Naruto had never seen anything quite like it. Enormous spires of pure white bone rose from the earth like the twisted garden of a demon or like the impossibly intricate ribcage of an unfathomable giant. It was impenetrable. If there was a way to navigate the odd and imposing structure, Naruto couldn't see it. The stranger aspect was the fact the bones were practically saturated in chakra, and that meant a shinobi had done this. However, it must have been some form of last stand, as no self-respecting shinobi would leave this kind of evidence behind of their fighting style. A Kage. Naruto tore his gaze away from the unique sight to see Fu analyzing it with a cold, calculating gaze that slowly roamed over the towers of bone. A clan thought extinct before even the bloodline rebellions that in some unique cases could manipulate their bone structure as a powerful defense or lethal offense. She had only known about the Lost Clan as they had played such a massive role in the initial stages of the rebellions, and their power, or at least that of those who carried their Kage Genkai, the Shikatsunyaku, was legendary. So this was Kage. That didn't sound right. He knew for a fact Kiri was still deeply embroiled in rebuilding their shattered and divided country. They would never launch an attack like this against Konoha. No, if Kage knew they had a Kage, one with the Kage Genkai no less, they would never risk him dying before he could restore the clan. In a way it was very sad. This large field of bones marked the end of quite possibly the most powerful clan in Mizu no Kuni, bar perhaps the Huzuki. Based on the direction the battles seemed to have gone, he most likely was fleeing to the north, to Ta no Kuni. Naruto narrowed his eyes at that, Otogaku, which meant Orochimaru had a hand in this. We should move on, see if there are survivors elsewhere. Naruto could sense nothing but the ambient chakra of the bone field here. There were no survivors. Leveling the bones to actually check would only alert anybody nearby, and the bones themselves were non-navigable. The trio quickly moved south, hurrying so they could at least get in and out before Konoha recovery teams could move in. Naruto knew that such a team would lack a medic as good as either him or Fu, and in the case of enemy shinobi would be more interested in interrogation than healing. Finally the dense forest broke for them as they emerged out into a vast swath of forest that appeared as though it had been completely leveled. Entire trees had been bisected to fall to the forest floor. The cuts were clean and fast, indicating a wind jutsu. However, none of that really interested Naruto compared to the weak and fading chakra signature he felt from somewhere in the middle of the new clearing. He rushed forward, Haku and Fu right on his heels, until he found what he was looking for. A single kunoichi was trapped underneath a massive trunk that was currently lying across her legs, no doubt crushing them from the extreme force if it hadn't already. This was particularly bad. Crush injuries were very tricky to deal with and had a certain time limit before the limb affected become unrecoverable. However, a very quick diagnostic jutsu told him that they weren't too late, so the blonde wasted no time circulating chakra through his arms, legs and back as he used what little of Tsunade's enormous strength he could to heft the massive tree off of the girl. She was unconscious, which was good, otherwise she would be screaming in agony right now. He didn't have to be a medic to know that her legs were a serious mess. They were crushed in multiple places and her right kneecap was completely shattered from the awkward position her leg now lay in. What was worse was that at the very edges of his sensory range he felt chakra signatures heading towards this position, rather quickly. Fu, help me here, we need to get her somewhere safe and fast, people are coming. The mint-haired girl nodded, having made a similar assessment to the blonde. Haku stood there a moment, feeling rather helpless in the situation. He was used to dealing with minor, trivial wounds that Zabuza would get, nothing on this magnitude. He had been reading up on techniques and practices, but reading and doing were two very different things. However, there was one way he could help. Genjutsu was not his forte despite his impressive chakra control, but he could cast one that would buy them time to get away at least, confusing the approaching party. When the Konoha recovery team arrived minutes later, they found nothing but an empty clearing of sliced down trees. It wouldn't be until later that they would break the genjutsu. By then it was too late. Tayuya awoke. Well, that alone was enough to surprise her, especially after that Tsuna bitch had practically brought the entire forest down on top of her. Her mind was hazy and she couldn't think straight, but she knew she was alive. The gentle but irritating throb from her legs told her that much. Attempting to lift up her body proved useless. Obviously whatever was keeping her from feeling the pain in her legs was also keeping her muscles relaxed and unresponsive. However, her struggles didn't go unnoticed for too long as a soft, but undoubtedly male voice called out. You shouldn't try to move just yet, your legs need to stay elevated above your heart, and right now that's slightly precarious. Tayuya just about managed to lift her head long enough to see her legs, wrapped up in more bandages than she could count, were propped up against a very low branch of a tree. Her head flopped uselessly back down onto the soft sleeping mat she was lying on. From the smell of grass all around her and the clear sky above framed by tree canopies, she quickly worked out she was in a forest clearing. What the fuck's going on? She had meant a lot more venom in that question that had come out. She almost cringed from how weak and pitiful she sounded. It's okay, we found you in the forest and brought you here to heal you. Tayuya scoffed at that, groaning as the action caused her to burst into a fit of coughs. Naruto just calmly waited for them to subside. The damage to her legs wasn't the only thing wrong with her, she had a few broken ribs and multiple lacerations around her body. Finally the redhead's coughing fit died down and she laid her head back to stare up at the sky angrily. Oh yeah, you do that out of the fucking good of your heart or something. This time Tayuya managed to push some spite into her words, however Naruto was unperturbed. From the condition she was found in, some hostility was to be expected. In a way, I suppose you could say that. Tayuya snorted again, but more carefully as to not irritate her obviously injured chest, probably also covered in bandages, although she didn't have the energy to check. She probably looked like a mummy right now. Fucking great. So how did you end up underneath a tree? Tayuya glared at nothing again, lacking the will to lift her head up and actually look at the one talking to her. Fuck off, I'm not telling you anything, shithead. Naruto absently shrugged. He had fulfilled his duties as a medic for the most part. Everything else was just congenial, although he had to admit the girl was healing at an astounding rate, even for a kunoichi. How about a name then? I'm Naruto. Tayuya just turned her head slightly and spat in a random direction, knowing she wouldn't have hit Naruto based on where his voice was. It's Tayuya, you better fucking remember it, cocksucker, cuz I'm the one that's gonna kick your scrawny ass when I. Tayuya suddenly felt lightheaded as an odd warmth spread from somewhere around her chest, accompanied by a soft humming that she recognized from Kabuto as medical ninjutsu. Naruto just chuckled as Tayuya began to drift off, the medical ninjutsu he was using putting her to sleep so she wouldn't aggravate her own injuries. It seemed his latest patient had something of an anger issue. That would be fun. Tayuya's a nice name. The redhead couldn't even sneer as her world turned dark again. This time when Tayuya woke up she could instantly tell it was night. The sky was dark and it was considerably colder, although there was a blanket thrown over her fending off the worst of it. She grinned as she realized her curse mark had done its thing, healing her body at a rate most other shinobi would be green with envy over. However, while she now found she could actually lift up her torso, her legs seemed to be an entirely different matter. They screamed out in pain as she lowered them to the ground, making her grit her teeth in agony as she placed one foot forward, followed by the next. That's really inadvisable. The voice made her freeze. She had been hazy and barely lucid, but she recognized it as the voice that had talked with her before. Naruto, if she recalled correctly. Turning, her eyes actually opened in moderate surprise when she found a young, blonde-haired boy, younger than her even, sitting on a log and watching her calmly with squinted eyes. Despite your rapid healing, the bones in your legs are very weak right now. They were fractured in many places and your right kneecap was completely shattered. I'd hate for you to undo the work me and Fu did repairing it. Tayuya just scowled at the monk, but it was weakened by the pain she was feeling. The fuck you want anyway? I don't know you and you definitely don't fucking know me. She spat the words out, however Naruto seemed completely unfazed. Tsunade could be far more vulgar than this when she was properly drunk. Actually, I do recognize you. You were part of the group sustaining the barrier technique around the Hokage and Kage. As he spoke he opened his eyes and Tayuya had to catch herself from falling over in shock as a set of violet, rippled eyes met her own. In fact, she stumbled back, tripping over her own feet and crying out in pain as she fell back, expecting to feel the agonizing sting as she fell on her legs. However, instead she only found herself gently lowered to the ground. Naruto had moved faster than she could notice in her pained state, and he gently lowered her to the ground. Shit, you're that asshole that Orochimaru kept bitching about, the one with the fucked up eyes like that Uchiha prick. Naruto just shot her an amused glance. Maybe she was worse than a drunken Tsunade, a frightening prospect. You have a rather colorful vocabulary. Tayuya snarled at him and tried to wrestle out of his grip, however it was useless when it only caused her injuries to burn with pain. Fuck off. She started though when she realized just who it was she was cursing, the same boy that had driven off Orochimaru. He had seemed older back then though, maybe it was just the veritable tsunami of sand he had summoned and allowed to hover threateningly over their heads though. What do you want? This time she knew her voice sounded meek, because that was how she felt. It was like being near Orochimaru, knowing she was so absolutely and unquestionably outclassed, dwarfed by their power. Nothing really, although getting rid of that hideous mark on your neck would be rather nice. I can see chakra and that thing is so tainted and twisted it hurts just to look at. Tayuya started at that, he really didn't want anything from her. Her eyes narrowed angrily. That wasn't possible, nobody was like that, not in the cruel, harsh world she had been raised in. What do you want with the curse mark? Naruto raised an eyebrow at that. Who in their right mind would allow something called a curse mark to be placed on their body? Like I said, I want to get rid of it, or at least the vile chakra inside of it. It really is unpleasant to be around. His danger senses kept going off every few seconds as his ability to sense through the water had him cringing at the evil chakra inside that seal. Yeah, well, good fucking luck, it can't be removed. Naruto just raised an eyebrow and placed a hand on her neck, right above the seal, making the girl flinch away from the contact. What the fuck are you doing, Blondie? Naruto just stared at her blankly for a moment, pondering whether or not this was a good idea before shrugging nonchalantly. It's a seal, it needs chakra. With that simple explanation Naruto began absorbing all the chakra he could from the seal only to widen his eyes in shock. It was like the Gobi all over again. As soon as the vile chakra entered his system his arm began to burn. It hurt so much he immediately began to vent the horrible chakra out from his other arm, directly into the ground. Tayuya could only watch in amazement as that familiar burning sensation that was a constant reminder of the curse mark slowly faded away. At the same time an increasingly large circle of deadening grass began to spread out from where Naruto pumped the bastardized chakra into the earth. What the fuck was that? Tayuya was shocked as the last of the throbbing in her shoulder died down as Naruto finally let go of the ground, revealing a large circle around 4 meters wide of completely deadened grass. Like I said, Naruto's breathing was slightly ragged from the experience. The chakra really was unpleasant, that chakra was vile. Just having it in your body like that was probably taking years off your lifespan. Not to mention whatever that substance was in the seal he had removed almost as soon as he had seen the thing, some kind of enzyme. Tayuya just stared at the patch of dead earth in shock for a moment before regaining her senses, narrowing her eyes as she shot a weary look at the blonde. Well, now what? What are you going to do to me? Naruto breathed in deeply as he allowed his breath to steady before standing up, making sure Tayuya could support herself first. Nothing, if you feel like you can walk then you're free to go. As if to emphasize this he walked back over to where he had been sitting before, a small log by a cozy-looking campfire, not that Tayuya would ever call anything cozy. 2 other mats surrounded the fire, taken up by a mint-haired girl with caramel skin and a dark-haired boy that looked far too feminine. Tayuya noticed with a small amount of shock that she had been lying on Naruto's bed, probably for more than a few nights now. However, she set that aside as she stayed where she was, just staring at the blonde as he calmly gazed back. Just like that. You'd just let me go. Naruto just shrugged and Tayuya hesitated for only a moment before scrambling to her feet ungracefully and limping away from the camp as fast as she was able, which, embarrassingly, was pitifully slow. Naruto watched her leave with a small sigh. He would have hoped the kunoichi would at least stay long enough for her injuries to fully heal, but in the end he wasn't going to hold somebody against their will, even if she could potentially provide information on Orochimaru. Tayuya couldn't help but sneer at her own pathetic situation. She was limping through a forest, no clue where she was and no idea where to go. She could never return to Orochimaru now, not after failing her mission like this. The Uchiha brat just had to go and refuse Orochimaru's invitation, stating that somebody who couldn't kill the Hokage had no right to say they were strong enough to teach him. Fucking prick. That of course had resulted in the Sound 4 kidnapping the little bastard, but not before their fight alerted practically the whole of Konoha. They had gotten out okay, but the recovery teams had been on them fast. However, she felt confident they would have been able to get away if those assholes from Suna hadn't shown up as reinforcements. At this point she didn't even know if Kimimaro was successful in getting the Uchiha across the border to Ta no Kuni. She winced again as another stumble brought her back to her present situation, making her stop against a nearby tree. Her breath came out in ragged gasps. Without the curse mark and whatever jutsu Naruto had been using to dull her pain, she felt every step like a knife stabbing into her legs. A lone tear trailed down her cheek from the pain, unable to hold it back any longer. She had no idea what to do anymore. As soon as Orochimaru worked out she was alive, and she was sure he would send somebody to deal with her. Loose ends weren't tolerated after all. However, her head perked up as she looked back in the direction she came from. That blonde kid was strong, really strong enough at least to provide her protection, long enough for her to improve her skills enough to deal with whatever flunky Orochimaru sent her way. She couldn't imagine it though, debasing herself to playing nice, just to eke out sympathy and protection from a kid 2 years her junior. Well, it was either her pride or her life in the end, and after another few moments of hesitation her decision was made. Cammy fucking damn it. She was screaming to nobody, but it at least felt nice to vent before she turned around and trudged back the way she came. Chapter 57, Nature Part 3. Aggression unchallenged is aggression unleashed. Phaedras. So tell me again why the hell we're looking for this broad again. Naruto sighed for what seemed like the umpteenth time that day as their motley group slowly walked down the wide, barren path that cut across Hinokuni and acted as the main trade route for the east and west countries. In that same vein, it was the most protected road, quite possibly on the entire continent, and every mile or so they would come across a small stationing of either the daimyo's samurai or a patrolling group of shinobi from Konoha. Naruto wasn't particularly worried though. Their little group was barely given a passing glance. Hyugas weren't used for such menial chores, so he had no need to worry about the Byakugan. Naruto already told you to Yuya-san, we are searching for Tsunade because she holds one of the 3 contracts of the Sannin, the slugs to be more accurate. Naruto nodded absently from his position at the head of the group, glad for Haku's explanation. He wasn't sure if he could take explaining it to the irate redhead again. Yeah, I get that, but why the hell are we looking for her? The former Oto Kunoichi really stressed the why, as she lightly glared at Haku. The girl had been a very unique addition to their group. Even in the 2 weeks she had been with them she had somehow managed to get under each and every one of their skins. Even the normally unflappable Fu didn't seem to be immune to the girl's naturally abrasive attitude. And I heard the question very clearly to Yuya-san. Haku's voice became slightly strained as he forced the honorific out through somewhat gritted teeth. Oddly enough, and against what Naruto might have previously thought, it appeared that Haku was the most easily affected by Tayuya's attitude. The two often squabbled as they walked, Tayuya's harsh voice clashing with Haku's normally soft, placating tone. However, Naruto couldn't find it in himself to complain. The past week alone the stoic ice wielder had showed more expression and emotion than he had the entire time traveling in the group. Well, whoop-de-fucking do to you femboy, you have ears. Although the swearing he most certainly could have done without. Naruto wasn't sheltered by any means. He had heard plenty of swears growing up in Konoha. He just thought there were better ways to deal with frustration or irritation than needlessly vulgar language. So seriously, why the fuck we going after this Tsunade person? I'm very well acquainted with one of the Sannin, I don't really fancy meeting another. Naruto thought now would be a good time to cut in before the argument could escalate any further. Tsunade holds a contract with the slug summons and their realm is one of the few places we know that's in tune with nature. Considering I am unable to summon creatures with a pre-existing contract and an active summoner, we will have to find her to talk with Katsuya-san. Naruto was just glad he had met the leader, and sole member, of the slug clan once before, otherwise finding Shikatsu Forest would be impossible. What about one of the other Sannin's contracts then? This bitch moves around too much. Naruto's eye only twitched slightly at that. To be honest, he didn't think that was a particularly inaccurate description of Tsunade, at least when they first met, but he had a lot of respect for his one-time sensei. Although he had to admit, finding her proved to be far more difficult when he had no idea of even which county the woman and her niece were in. Well, we could always try finding Orochimaru and force him to reveal the location of Ryuchi Cave. The next argument on Tayuya's tongue died at that, her expression shifting between irritation and fear. And the only time I have ever met with the third Sannin was in a bathhouse in Ta no Kuni when he was peeping on women. The two girls in the group gained an indignant expression on their faces while Haku just seemed mildly perturbed by the thought of one of the world's strongest shinobi acting so immaturely. So Tsunade it is. Tayuya frowned at that, but it didn't seem like the argument had left her completely. Well, what about one of your summons then? If the fucking Sannins contracts all hold the key to whatever stupid ass training you're trying to do, then surely one of the others might. Naruto just shrugged at that. Tayuya knew roughly what his abilities were, definitely enough that she knew he was far out of her league. However, that had already been confirmed when he had threatened to engulf that rooftop in a small desert's worth of sand. I suppose one of them could. I suppose you have a list of all the summoning creatures in existence then. Naruto spoke flippantly, but the underlying hint of annoyance was clear and didn't go missed by the volatile redhead. Aw, fuck off, shithead, I'm just tired of all this aimless walking. We don't even know where this broad is. Naruto just sighed again, something he felt would be a fairly common occurrence traveling with Tayuya. Nobody asked you to come with us, Tayuya-san. And no one here is forcing you to follow. You are very welcome to stay at the next town we come across. Again, Naruto was surprised by the slightly venomous tone Haku used as the Yuki addressed their latest member. However, that finally seemed to take the wind out of Tayuya's sails. It was a poorly kept secret she was traveling with them out of fear of what Orochimaru might do. I still don't get why we didn't stay in Kusa no Kuni for longer. At that, Naruto sighed, but for once in the past 2 weeks it wasn't out of irritation. They hadn't spent nearly the time that he would have liked in the forests of Kusa no Kuni. There had been a strangely high shinobi presence as they wandered the country, and it turned out that the people of Kusa didn't particularly like travelers that didn't seem to have a purpose being there. They had been forced to cut their search short or risk being taken for spies. That wouldn't have ended well for anybody. Because we didn't need to cause an incident. Tayuya huffed noisily in what Naruto assumed was supposed to be a discreet gesture. However, discreet didn't really describe Tayuya all that well. Yeah, right. I've seen how powerful you are. You guys could take on some Kusa shinobi no problem. Naruto just rolled his eyes from his position at the front, wondering how somebody like the former Oto Kunoichi had lasted as long as she had in such a normally peaceful and quiet group. It doesn't matter if we could. At that, Naruto raised an eyebrow. Fu rarely became involved in conversations with Tayuya, preferring to ignore the redhead. There are better ways to solve conflict. Again, Tayuya just scoffed, and Naruto suddenly had a vivid flashback to his early days speaking with the Kyuubi. What? Like fucking running away like cowards? Naruto just gave a soft smile as he turned back to the loud girl, surprising her mildly by the disarming expression. Of course, that only made her put up her guards. No, by choosing to avoid unnecessary violence. Tayuya blinked at the answer, but the shocked expression only lasted a moment before it was replaced by her usual scowl and her arms crossing under her chest. Whatever. Naruto simply allowed a small smirk to cross over his face as he turned back to the path ahead, the group settling into a slightly awkward silence that he would treasure for the moment. So seriously, you guys have no fucking clue where she is? Naruto just groaned as his head fell forward slightly. Fu lounged lazily against a tree, breathing deeply as she enjoyed the warmth from the fire in front of her. It was a rare moment of peace within the group, mostly because she was alone right now. Naruto was off, doing what Naruto did. She suspected he was talking with his inner tenants or training, but she could be sure. Haku was collecting herbs to try and create a salve he had taken an interest to in the scrolls he constantly read. Tayuya was, well, Fu couldn't honestly bring herself to care what the abrasive redhead was doing. A slight frown etched her features as her thoughts turned towards the latest and obviously unwelcome member of their group. She offered little to the group as a whole, not that she suspected Naruto would ever think of it like that. She had always admired his ability to look beyond the past of others in an attempt to either help or understand them, but for once Fu wished he had just left it alone. To the normally in control Jinchuriki, it was almost inexplicable how easily the redhead managed to get her aggravated. That's why she considered it better for her to simply ignore the girl. However, even that didn't seem to really work. After all, it was increasingly difficult to ignore when the girl lashed out verbally at the group. Naruto had told her it was probably a side effect of that seal he had removed from her, but Fu thought it more likely the girl was just naturally aggressive. For a moment she wondered just what kind of environment the young teen would have had to grow up in to develop like this. However, she pushed that from her thoughts quickly. Trying to understand people was Naruto's thing. Fu was simply content to follow after her friend and help him where she could. Unfortunately, if that meant putting up with a particularly volatile ex-Oto Kunoichi, then she would. Her ear twitched as she heard the faint sound of lightning somewhere off in the distance. However, she knew for a fact that the sky was perfectly clear. Cracking open an eye, she confirmed that, seeing only a few stars above her in the darkening sky. However, not too soon after, the same chirping sound of lightning graced her ears, forcing her head to turn off in the direction of a seemingly random part of the forest. With a small, unnoticeable sigh, she dragged herself to her feet. The group had been traveling for a while now, and she had been so glad for even this small breather. It didn't take her too long to silently move through the thick trunks of the Hai no Kuni forest, landing without a whisper on a thick bough of an old oak that seemed almost out of place amongst the smaller coniferous trees surrounding it. A small smile found its way onto her features through as she found Naruto at the center of a clearing, wearing a calm but focused expression as the faintest hints of lightning danced around his fingers. In front of him stood an exact replica of himself. However, the clone was settled into a different stance, one that made Fu frown as she didn't recognize it. The two blondes burst into action as a single leaf from a nearby tree fell to the ground, the original lunging forward in a low stance with his two-pointed finger outstretched in an attempt to end the fight quickly. However, the clone anticipated the move thanks to their shared vision and rushed forward just as quickly, launching his body up and over the original in a tight flip. Mid-air, the clone tried to lash out with a series of vicious punches that had Fu widen her eyes in surprise. She had never seen Naruto fight with punches before. What she thought was his main aggressive style, the Kaminari no Mai, relied on lightning-enhanced jabs to neutralize opponents. When the two blonde broke from their scuffle, she tried to analyze the stance more, noticing that when the clone landed, the air around its hands had a slight haze to it, as if the skin itself was giving off far more heat than should have been healthy. This was proved when the clone went back in for another exchange, only to be thrown violently by the original. It just managed to twist its body to avoid being dispelled against a tree, but it had to place a hand down to steady itself. When it bounced back off, there was a deep black handprint in the bark that was quietly smoldering from the controlled heat pouring off of the clone's hands. Fu had to blink from incredulity. She had never realized Naruto had such a violent and lethal taijutsu style, although it made sense that she had never seen him use it before. She tore her gaze away from the mesmerizing, almost dance-like fight as she noticed that she wasn't the only observer to the beautiful display. She dropped to the forest silently, right behind an equally enraptured Tayuya. He is very impressive when he trains, isn't he? The redhead nearly jumped out of her skin when Fu's soft voice cut through the still air right next to her ear. She was whispering out of courtesy to Naruto, though. She didn't doubt he knew that they were there with his impressive sensory abilities. "Aw, what the fuck?" However, from the harsh whisper Tayuya gave, the redhead had no idea that her hiding was ineffective. She glared at the mint-haired teen before her expression waved and she looked back to where the two Narutos were still sparring. "How is he so fast? I can barely keep up with his movements, and he's younger than I am." Fu raised an eyebrow at that. Naruto's movements were slightly blurry from his speed, but she had no real trouble watching. Then again, she had plenty of experience sparring and fighting against fast opponents. She also had to be able to see where she was going in her tailed states. Naruto trains very hard for his abilities. Tayuya's eyes narrowed slightly as Fu saw them visibly strained to keep up with the maneuvers the two blondes were going through in an attempt to overwhelm the other. Fu was a little surprised that the fight had gone on this long. It would only take one good jab from the original to pop the clone. The style it was using must be very fierce. "I bet it's those eyes of his." Orochimaru was always going on about the unfairness Dujutsu gave bloodline users. Fu's eyes narrowed at the accusation. She knew exactly how hard Naruto had trained and how much he had suffered to get to where he was. You don't know anything. Yuya turned to the verdette, her features still locked in that ever-present scowl as she glared at the younger girl. Oh really? Well then fucking enlighten me. Fu's normally impassive features twitched as she had to visibly strain not to give a glare of her own. She restrained herself though, not willing to drop to the redhead's level. She knew she was more in control than that. You know nothing about those eyes, you don't even know how Naruto got them to you. Yuya continued to simply glare at the girl, not making a motion to respond. She couldn't imagine it would be that bad. They activated when Naruto was forced to watch the people he cared about most in the world be killed right in front of him. Yuya blinked at that, for a moment looking as though she regretted saying anything, however her stubborn attitude kicked in a moment later. Well so fucking what, shit happens to people, you think. He's the only one that has suffered. Yuya was a little taken aback as the calm, expressionless look on Fu's face finally dropped away as the girl openly scowled at her. No, every one of us has suffered in their own way, but you wouldn't care about that, would you? You're only here for protection because you were scared and Naruto was the strongest person you knew that was nearby. Beyond that you couldn't possibly care less about what kind of person he is. Yuya quickly got over her shock at the Jinchuriki's 180 in personality as her tone became venomous again. You don't know me bitch, you don't understand a thing about me. Fu never backed down though, her face now firmly set in a cold, angry expression that would chill a lesser man. Oh I understand you, you're the type to latch onto somebody you see as strong because you recognize your own weakness. You hope that by being around them you can become stronger yourself. You're a coward. At this point Yuya was practically shaking with rage as she took a step forward, getting right in Fu's face. Who the fuck are you calling a coward, bug girl? At that Fu's eyes narrowed dangerously as her hands slowly tightened into fists by her side. Memories of her time in Tokigakure, memories she would rather leave forgotten, welled up in her mind. The cold glares, the indifferent looks, the names and the pain that marked her childhood before Naruto saved her, she relived it all again as she stared at the redhead in front of her. Do not call me that. Her tone was icy and low, the orange of her irises slowly spreading out into the rest of her eyes as the air around her began to shift and bend in a heat haze. Yuya gained a smirk as she stepped forward again, uncaring of the heat that was beginning to build up around the Jinchuriki. And what are you going to do about it, bug girl? Slowly, the air around Fu began to turn an alarming shade of red as her eyes turned completely orange, almost looking like the compound eyes of an insect. Yuya's eyes widened though as, without warning, Fu suddenly lunged for her, the red cloak of chakra around her body instantly snapping into focus, a single spindly tail flicking out behind her. The redhead dived back to avoid being decapitated by the burning red claws that had materialized around the verdette's hands. On instinct she reached for the pouch where her flute usually rested, however her hand met nothing but air. With a grimace she remembered it had been neatly bisected in the clash with the Suna bitch, and when this group had taken her away they couldn't have known to try and find it. Right now she was without her main weapon, and without it her genjutsu was severely weaker. She didn't even have her curse seal to fall back on anymore. I told you not to say it. Fu came at her ferociously, not letting up for a moment as she and the chakra cloak moved in tandem in an attempt to catch her. She spun to avoid a piece of shrapnel from a tree Fu had just blown through, only for her eyes to widen in shock as she barely caught a red blur flying through the air at her. All in a moment she felt the wind leave her as a bone-shattering blow caught her in the stomach, instantly sending her reeling through the air. She coughed from her position on the ground, a large dent in the tree behind her showing where she had hit. She looked up at an ominous popping sound to see Fu standing in front of her, cracking her knuckles in a manner eerily reminiscent of Tsunade, not that Yuya would know that. However, before the Biju-empowered girl could launch the blow that probably would have had Yuya in severe pain for the next week, the ground beneath them suddenly sprung to life. Yuya was in no condition to resist as sand suddenly enveloped her form, simultaneously capturing her and pulling her out of the way of Fu's punch. Fu was more aware of what was happening, but only in her one-tailed form. She wasn't fast enough to avoid the sand, and it quickly caught her in a similar manner. Should I ask what this was about? Both girls turned, the red chakra bleeding away from Fu and into the sand, to see Naruto looking at them both, arms crossed over his chest and a distinctly disappointed expression on his face. Tayuya was too in pain to particularly care, but Fu flinched under the unyielding gaze. She knew it was aimed firmly at her, and it almost physically hurt her to see Naruto looking at her that way. Tayuya was lucid enough though that she managed to work her usual scowl onto her face. "This doesn't involve you, Shith." She cringed as for a moment the sand tightened slightly, reminding her that she probably had at least a cracked rib. Naruto simply gave her a level look as the sand lowered the two back to the ground, short some of their chakra of course. "If it is serious enough to cause Fu, the most emotionally stable person I know, to give into her rage enough that she actively uses her tenant's chakra, then it involves me. I don't want to have the death of a member of this group on her conscience." Tayuya's scowl only deepened at that. She hated the implication that she was weak. "You say that like she'd fucking win." Naruto raised an eyebrow almost in amusement as the last of the sand finally drained away into the ground, returning to the elements it had been pulled from. "And you think you would win? A genjutsu type without her main method of creating genjutsu against a jinchuriki with no such restrictions and 7 taels worth of potent chakra to draw on." Tayuya just growled something out under her breath as Naruto turned to Fu, making the girl flinch again under that unwavering look. "Fu." The girl looked up, having managed to rein in her motions in the time since Naruto had forcefully removed her chakra cloak. "Please don't say it, Naruto. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." The blonde looked at her a moment before nodding slowly, dismissing it that easily. "All right, I believe you." The green-haired teen quickly nodded to affirm what she said as she got back to her feet, shaking off the dizziness from the sudden lack of chakra. It never ceased to amaze her how powerful Naruto's Pratapath was. "Hey, why the fuck does she get off scot-free? She attacked me." Naruto turned back to Tayuya, his expression still impassive, however there was a hint of something else in his eyes, a slight coldness. "Listen, Tayuya, Fu is one of my oldest friends. If she says something I will believe her because that is what trust is. The things I do are and always will be for the people I care about the most, the people precious to me. It is why I fight, why I train, and my reason for growing stronger. I could include you in that list. You could grow to become one of my friends, one of the people I care about." His eyes narrowed slightly and Tayuya she couldn't break away from that steady, mesmerizing gaze. "However, I can only extend the olive branch so far before it slips from my hand. If you stay the way you are, if you continue to antagonize my friends, then I have no qualms leaving you behind." With that shocking statement, Naruto turned and walked back to the camp, the gentle jingle of his shakuju fading out of earshot as the two girls were left on their own. "He's serious, you know." Tayuya snapped out of her slight stupor as Fu began to walk away, following after Naruto towards the camp. The redhead was left there on the ground, stewing in her own thoughts as the sun continued to descend below the horizon. After a good 10 minutes she finally stood up and without a word began making her way back towards the flickering lights of the camp, her mind still a mess of thoughts that she was struggling to process. The wind whistled softly as the small group of teens made their way along a much smaller dirt path than before. They were very out of the way from most civilized areas, the nearest town being almost 3 miles away in the direction they were walking away from. Their last tip as to the whereabouts of Tsunade placed her in Cha no Kuni, southeast of Hai no Kuni. Apparently there was a large gathering there in the capital for an annual gambling tournament, one of the largest on the continent. Considering they had no other leads and Naruto didn't want to instigate Tsunade's wrath by summoning her, it was their best bet currently. Naruto raised an eyebrow as he continued to read the small green book in his hand. They hadn't been idle as they traveled. In every town large enough to have a library they donated a few days trying to gather any information they could on nature, chakra and senjutsu, mostly coming up empty. However, in the last town they had passed through, a small and cozy place straddling the border between the two nations, Naruto had come across an interesting book one of his clones had spotted. "What is it?" Fu was walking along next to him, having had to look up from the book that she was reading, a very dry script regarding chakra that had yet to provide any new or even useful information. "There's a story in here about the Shodai Hokage. The town, aptly named Mokuzaicho, he had gotten the book from, had apparently at one time been a trading post that the Senju clan used often during the warring clans period and weren't ashamed of abusing that fact to draw in tourists. And Fu had a right to be skeptical. Mokuzaicho was full of vendors spouting exaggerated and fantastical stories about the Senju and their paragon Hashirama Senju. Everything about them had to be taken with a grain of salt. This book says that in battle the Shodai would sometimes don red markings about his face while his eyes turned a most brilliant golden, his abilities becoming not in the realm of humanity but in that of Kami himself. He looked up, checking the expression of his companions. Sure enough, they seemed to be thinking the new information over. So what? He sometimes liked to put on war paint. It wasn't unheard of from that time. Naruto nodded at the statement, still a little surprised that something so inoffensive had come from Tayuya. Ever since her talking to a few weeks ago, she had become very withdrawn, rarely speaking to the rest of the group and trailing behind them as they walked. When she did speak, it was in a quiet, somber tone that lacked any of the fiery edge the group had come to associate with the previously abrasive redhead. But remember what Haku found in that monastery's library, about the energy of nature changing the color of the iris. Naruto nodded again at Fu's counter-argument. With Tayuya not starting any arguments lately, the group had gone back to some semblance of normality. Okay, but I didn't know the Shodai had any summons. You'd think something like that would be common knowledge. Naruto frowned as Haku finally waded in on the conversation, bringing up a good point. It would be, but he didn't. During the time the use of summons was rare, and among the largest and most powerful clans like the Senju and the Uchiha, it was seen as a weakness to rely on the help of those outside the bloodline. At that, everybody in the group seemed surprised as they all came to the same conclusion. That means the Shodai Hokage might have had a way to manipulate nature chakra without a summoning contract. The group paused as they mulled that over. The ramifications seemed good for them. Perhaps they wouldn't have to find Tsunade after all. Well, that's great and all, but it's not like we can ask the guy how he learned, being dead and all. Naruto just nodded with a small frown before pausing. Literally, he stopped dead in the middle of the road, nearly causing Tayuya to bump into the back of him. Oi, watch it. Naruto ignored her, feeling as though he should be slapping himself for his own stupidity. Of course, I can't believe I forgot. The others in the group simply stared at him incredulously, wondering what he was talking about. Their expressions changed to that of curiosity though when the young monk pulled a small jar off of his belt that only Fu recognized. However, the other two quickly realized its significance when Naruto placed it on the ground, pushing chakra through it and causing it to expand to almost half the height of Naruto himself. Whoa, what the hell is that thing? It seemed that even as withdrawn as Tayuya had become, she still had a few moments where her real personality shone though. It's the Kohaku no Juhei, an artifact from the time of the original sage. It's said to be able to seal anything within its confines. Naruto nodded absently as he heard Fu sum up the enormous stone pot in front of them, only half listening as he gently removed the lid. Luckily there was no intense suction, no all-consuming gale like had happened last time. After all, he hadn't activated it. However, he was now walking into unknown territory, drawing something out of the jar that had been sealed. He knew it must be possible. After all, the Hachibi had been sealed multiple times, meaning it had either been drawn out or had escaped. Naruto just hoped it was the former. Deciding to just try the first thing that came to mind, he placed his hand gently against the cool surface of the ancient artifact, slowly working his chakra into the aged stone as he kept two names prominent in his mind. For a good few moments nothing happened, but as Naruto continued to feed his chakra into the pot, seemingly without end, the liquid inside began to stir. Taking this as a good sign, Naruto kept feeding the hungry jar, pushing enough chakra in to completely replenish the reserves of more than a few junin. Just as Naruto was beginning to feel the drain, the pot rumbled once, ominously. Then, faster than most could react, the deep maroon liquid within the artifact seemingly leapt from the pot, splitting into two as it arced through the air. The two large globules landed with a wet squelch on the ground, writhing and convulsing for a moment as if being twisted and formed by the invisible hands of some master craftsman. Quickly, in the span of only a few seconds, the indistinct forms gained outlines, followed by clarity and eventually detail. The last thing to return to the two was color, and before the group even knew it, there standing before them in all their glory, wrapped up in the armor that the period was well remembered for, were the Shodai and Nidaime Hokage, Hashirama and Tobirama Senju themselves. Chapter 58, Nature Part 4. A good name will shine forever, proverb. Holy shit. Tayuya's deadpan tone finally shattered the silence that had overcome the group as they stared at the two reanimated Hokage, two of the most powerful men to have ever lived. Despite the crass nature of the statement, the others had to admit it was a good way to sum up what they were seeing. Even Yuya was not spared from the shock of seeing the supposedly dead shinobi, as she had never been privy to Orochimaru's plans. Only Kabuto and Kimimaro held that honor. What's more was she hadn't even seen them being summoned, having been too focused on maintaining the barrier, keeping the Anbu out like the rest of the Sound 4. Is that really? Even Haku, who had no proper shinobi training in a real village and the history lessons that came with it, was able to recognize the practically legendary men that were standing before them, standing and doing nothing. The two shinobis' faces were completely blank masks, devoid of emotion or even signs that there was a functioning mind behind their strange and blackened eyes. Naruto. What's wrong with them? Fu's question unknowingly mimicked the thoughts of the rest of the group as they all looked at the statue-like Kage. Naruto didn't have an answer for them though, as he stared at the two resurrected Kage with a scrutinizing eye. He was definitely angry and slightly unfocused when he had entered the barrier back in Konoha, but he was sure he had seen them move. After all, they had to react to his call for the Kohaku no Juhei to seal them in the first place. I'm not sure. He experimentally waved a hand in front of their faces, only for the two legendary ninja to suddenly jump back, surprising the group as they entered unrecognizable but obviously dangerous stances. The four teens reacted similarly, jumping back to get out of range of any attacks that might come their way. Naruto was fully prepared to drown this place in a tidal wave of sand before he let the reanimated Kage hurt his friends. However, after a few moments of incredibly tense silence, the two Kage simply shifted back into neutral stances, their faces never straying from those disconcertingly blank masks. Wait. Naruto was the first to drop out of his stance, allowing the chakra he had built up to disperse harmlessly back into his system, ready to be pulled back up at a moment's notice. I think it's only reactionary. Sure enough, when he walked back up to the two Kage, they didn't react in the slightest, only looking ahead with their vacant, dead eyes. Naruto watched the two for a few more moments, marveling at just how real they were. This was the same jutsu Orochimaru had used to bring Shizuku back, except not quite. At the time, Orochimaru had called them mindless drones. Then what had made them different? As he observed them, he noticed something peculiar about the chakra in their heads. Small amounts, almost unnoticeably so, were draining into something. But more importantly, the near-infinite chakra that made the Edo Tensei Jutsu so dangerous seemed to be coming from there, without any real source. His eyes lit up slightly as he remembered Orochimaru plunging a kunai wrapped with some kind of talisman or sealing tag into the back of the reincarnated Shizuku's head. Naruto, what are you? Haku trailed off as his eyes widened in shock. Naruto had walked behind the two Kage that still had yet to react to his presence and in one clean movement, pushed his hands into the back of their heads. The other three teens winced at the disgusting action before they realized there was no blood. Naruto's hand just seemed to slip seamlessly into the two Kage's skulls. A moment later he brought his hands back out, and with them, two recognizable kunai, talismans limply hanging from their hilts. Naruto walked back around to where the rest of the group was standing, all watching in amazement at the changes that overcame the Kage's bodies. As if they had been bleached, the vibrant colors across their bodies seemed to fade slightly, their skin becoming a pallid, unhealthy gray. Cracks began breaking out across their forms as if they were aged terracotta soldiers as opposed to the bodies of two powerful shinobi. Finally, their eyes seemed to brighten slightly as the spark of consciousness was relit as the Edo Tensei's hold over them was broken. Wow, you know, when I agreed to you developing this jutsu Tobarama, I didn't think you would make it so uncomfortable. The Shodai cracked his neck slowly as he shrugged his shoulder, like a man pulling the kinks out after staying still for too long, which Naruto supposed was somewhat true. Yes, but when I developed this jutsu, and subsequently named it a kinjutsu, I never thought we would be on the receiving end of it. In comparison to the surprisingly jovial and upbeat tone of the Shodai, the Nadaime spoke with a cool and collected tone that reminded Naruto a lot of Fu. Yeah, well, I told you it was a bad idea and you never listened. I bet this is karma or something. Naruto raised an eyebrow as the Kage continued to converse, apparently not noticing or not caring that they were not alone. We were in a war, Hashirama. You always were too soft to do what was necessary, always taking the mediating position. The Shodai just laughed off the rather cold tone of his brother and slapped the chronologically younger man on the back, much to the man's apparent chagrin. Oh come now, You know, if it wasn't for me we would have been embroiled in all that pointless fighting for the rest of our lives. The Nadaime didn't seem to acknowledge that as he looked around at their surroundings, finally noticing, or at least acknowledging, the teens' existence. Naruto couldn't help but notice that while the Shodai seemed relaxed and comfortable, the Nadaime was more stiff, tensed and ready to react to anything. He guessed that was the difference between dying during peace times and dying in the middle of a war. Enough, we've had this conversation many times before and we are in the company of others. It would be best if not everybody knew you were a childish simpleton in life. Naruto blinked at the rather callous description of the Shodai from his brother, although there was an underlying hint of affection in the harsh words. However, to his continued shock, Hashirama Senju pouted from his brother's words, actually pouted. "Mo, you were always so much like father, Tobirama." The Shodai turned to look at the group of teens, a warm and disarming smile crossing his features. Naruto had heard and read the legends of course, but nothing quite prepared him for the sheer charisma the first ever Kage practically exuded. "Hello there, young ones, it is a shame that we should meet under such extenuating circumstances, but I suppose I should be thanking you." He looked specifically at Naruto as the Nadaime cut in, also looking at Naruto but with a far more critical eye. "Yes, had you not come and sealed our bodies in the Kohaku no Juhei, I fear we might have killed young Saru." He coughed, seemingly a little annoyed at his slight slip-up. "Hiruzen." He stared at Naruto appraising Ly for a moment before his eyes drifted to the enormous pot to the side. "Truly Konoha has changed quite a bit if we have come into the possession of one of the sage's artifacts." However, as his eye continued to roam the area and the rest of the teens, it quirked up in intrigue. "However, it seems we are not in Konoha, or even Hai no Kuni anymore. Unless the lands have truly changed that much since our era." He leveled a questioning look at Naruto again, taking in everything of the young blonde. "You do not bear a Konoha headband, and I specifically remember making those mandatory for wear during my time, so you are not a shinobi. You bear the robes and marking of a fire temple monk, yet you do not stand as they would, so you are not fully trained in their ways. You wear what I believe is the old Hittite of the Nadeshiko tribe, but neither of the girls here bear their headband, so you have traveled extensively. You are on your pilgrimage, are you not? Yet you aided in the invasion of Konoha, meaning you bear some ties to the village." The deceased Hokage looked down a moment before coming back up and catching Naruto in the eyes. "So you are a runaway?" Naruto was stunned, amazed at how quickly and thoroughly the Nadaime had broken him down on appearance alone. However, it didn't appear as though he was done. "You are too young to have deserted as a genin, and you lack any of the trappings of a shinobi, so it was before you were an academy student. The question is why?" It only took the man a few more moments to come to an apparent conclusion as he looked up and stared into Naruto's eyes. "When I was being controlled, I remember seeing your eyes, yet it was only in passing. Open them." For some reason Naruto just felt compelled to obey. Opening his eyes, he could see how this man was made Hokage. Interesting. However, for all his knowledge and shrewdness, that was all he said over the revelation of Naruto's eyes. The blonde was under no illusion the man didn't know they were the Rinnegan. Ooh, do me next." Tayuya actually looked uncharacteristically excited as the Nadaime turned to look at the redhead, giving her a quick once-over before snorting. "Too easy." He dismissed her with a casual flick of his wrist as he turned his attention back to Naruto, leaving the former Oto Kunoichi in a shocked silence. "What dujutsu is that? I don't recognize it." Naruto turned away from Tayuya's shocked expression to find the Shodai uncomfortably close to him, peering into the boy's eyes. He backed off as the Hokage pouted again, once again shattering any of Naruto's preconceptions about the man. "You fool, that is the Rinnegan. If you had actually read any of those books father gave you instead of running off to play with your Uchiha friend, you would know that." Hashirama just looked at his brother with an over-exaggeratedly hurt expression, a hand over his heart. "You wound me, brother, with your cold words." Tobirama simply looked away with an irritated sigh, muttering something incoherent under his breath. The older brother got over his melodrama quickly though as he turned back to Naruto, an almost childlike look of interest across his features. Somehow Naruto had lost the ability to compare this man with his stoic visage carved into the Hokage monument in Konoha. "You really have the Rinnegan. That's so cool." Naruto was speechless, honestly and completely speechless. "So what's your name? I always hoped a Senju and an Uchiha would get together and have a kid, just to see if they would awaken the Rinnegan." He stood back a bit, a rather pleased expression on his face as he thought of an obviously fond memory. Hey, those Uchiha always thought they were so special with their secret tablet, as if the Senju didn't have their own way of remembering their ancestors. He looked back down, as if just remembering Naruto was there, and looked at him expectantly. Ah, Naruto Uzumaki Shodai-sama. The Senju paragon merely waved him off with a slightly irritated expression. Please, don't bother with the honorific, I always disliked all that dry political stuff. From the side the man's brother placed his fingers around the bridge of his nose as he looked up. And yet you managed to form an alliance between the two arguably most powerful shinobi clans on the continent to form the first hidden shinobi village. Hashirama just turned to his brother and gave him a brilliant smile, once again showing off that incredible charisma of his. I'm just that good. He turned back to the blonde just in time to miss his brother face palming violently. The Nadaime thought he had seen the last of this when his brother had died. So Naruto-kun, you have the Rinnegan. The semi-question was left hanging in the air as the two stared at one another, an awkward silence settling over everybody. Yeah, really, at this point Naruto was struggling to get over his shock at having his prior images of the Shodai irrevocably torn apart. At least the Nadaime seemed true to the history books. That's very cool. Naruto just nodded again as the awkward silence fell again until Tobirama finally broke it, coughing into his hand. Well, as enlightening as that was, my brother and I should really go ahead and return to where we are supposed to be. Our spirits are not supposed to be in this realm of existence. This finally snapped Naruto out of his shocked stupor as he quickly held up his hand, pausing the Nadaime who had been about to launch into hand seals, most likely deactivating the Edo Tensei. It would make sense that the jutsu's creator would know how to cancel its effects, especially for somebody with the foresight of Tobirama Senju's capacity. Wait, Hokage-sama, I actually wanted to ask you something. The silver-haired Kage paused before lowering his hands slowly. Very well, speak. After all, what good is wisdom if it cannot be passed down to the next generation? Naruto smiled at that. It sounded very much like something his Shisho, or even the Sandaime would say, unsurprising considering this man was the third sensei. Actually, Nadaime-san, I wanted to ask your brother something. It felt strange asking the brother of the, arguably, most powerful man to live since the original sage himself, permission to speak to said man. However, Tobirama simply quirked an eyebrow before nodding once stoically, allowing Naruto to turn to Hashirama, who was observing him curiously and with just a hint of amusement. Is it true that you have mastered nature chakra? The question seemed to catch both Senju off guard as they looked at the young boy incredulously. Wow, that's not something I would have thought would enter the history books. I thought for sure only my clan and my wife knew about. It was supposed to be secret after all. He looked at Naruto for a moment, and just for the briefest of seconds Naruto saw the same scrutinizing glint that the Nadaime constantly wore enter his eye. It somewhat reaffirmed his faith in the man's capacity as a Hokage. You said your name was Uzumaki, correct? Perhaps you were related to Mito in some way. Even Tobirama seemed to take interest in this. After all, he was a Senju, and despite his cold exterior, family was just as important to him as it was to his brother. I'm sorry, Shodai-san, I'm an orphan, I never knew my parents. A hint of sadness entered into Hashirama's eye at that, and Naruto was once again taken aback. It was so genuine and real, he found it hard to believe the man could so easily empathize with somebody he barely knew. I apologize then, me and my brother know the pain of not knowing our mother, however you Uzumaki always did treasure family to the utmost. I suppose you still had the support of your clan though. Even if the relation to Mito is not direct, there are still ties, and we Senju always remember our allies. Naruto nodded slowly. That much survived in the books at least. After all, the bonds between the Senju and Uzumaki were shown on every Konoha flak jacket that proudly bore the Uzumaki spiral. No, the Uzumaki clan was wiped out some time ago. Uzushio was destroyed in the Second Shinobi War. Hashirama blinked at that before his face took a downwards turn, looking to the ground as he genuinely mourned the passing of the Senju's greatest ally and friends, even during the warring period. Even Tobirama had a slightly mournful look pass over his features for a brief moment, however it passed and he looked up again. Second Shinobi War, you say? I had hoped that the elemental nations would see the folly of such large-scale conflict after the first one ended. Hashirama on the other hand just seemed completely confused. He had passed away before even the first war had broken out after all. There was war. I had hoped the Biju acting as deterrent would prevent such a thing. That was another thing Naruto took issue with after getting to know said Biju. However, he had no chance to speak as Tobirama turned to his brother. Not just war, a conflict between every great nation, worse than the warring clans period. Hashirama seemed very disturbed by that. His whole life had been worked into the pursuit of peace, and to know that had been dashed after his death was saddening. This was the fault of your foolishness, brother. Instead of a deterrent, you simply gave the other nations a weapon to use against us. Instead of handing out such power, you should have held it, used it to unify the land. That would have seen as the peace you convinced me was real when we were young. Apparently Hashirama didn't have a counter for that, as he stared at the ground forlornly before finally looking back up at Naruto. You say there were 2 such wars after my passing. Naruto just shook his head slowly, unsure of what to say though. Even in the brief time knowing this legendary man, he had come to actually like him. He was just a very empathetic and likable person. However, it seemed Fu decided to end his moral quandary for him as her stark, steady voice cut in. There were 3 wars, each worse than the last, as the major nations fought over such frivolous things as money and land, tearing apart the smaller nations that became their battlegrounds. Hashirama sighed at that. It was precisely what he had hoped to avoid when he handed out the Biju to the other Kage. However, the Nadaime seemed to take an interest in Fu, apparently sensing a kindred spirit in her calm, collected tone and calculating gaze. You are from Tokigakure, correct? If Fu was surprised about the quick deduction, she didn't show it. After all, Naruto had told her Kakashi had been able to tell as much from her fighting style and her appearance. She suspected the far shrewder and more observant Nadaime would easily be able to come to the same conclusion from whatever tells on her person gave it away, so she simply nodded once. The Nadaime had to suppress a small smirk seeing that, so like he was at that age. Why are you traveling with a Konoha defect, a Yuki who is a long way from home, and a Tsuchi no Kuni native who you clearly hold ill will towards? Again Fu made no signs of being surprised, even when Haku and Tayuya let out little gasps of shock. Naruto just seemed a little indignant he was now the Konoha defect. Because they are my friends. Another smirk pulled at the edges of the Nadaime's mouth, obviously satisfied with the answer. Then it is good to see that the will of fire burns even so far from the tree itself. He turned back to Naruto, ignoring his brother who seemed to be deep in thought about all the revelations he had received. You said you wanted to know about my brother's abilities with nature chakra, the art of senjutsu, correct? Naruto quickly nodded, wondering how they had gotten so off topic from this. What exactly is it you wish to know? It felt strange talking about the man when he was only a few feet away, but when the two were together it seemed Tobirama was the dominant brother, the older, but less mature Senju taking a back seat. It was a wonder Hashirama had become Hokage instead of Tobirama. Then again, at the time only Madara Uchiha could actually hope to match his power. Where did he learn to harness nature chakra? Without a summoning contract I am unable to ask one of the animal clans known for it, and I do not know which summons would know enough to summon them anyway. It is why I am currently looking for Tsunade of the Sannin, as she holds the slug contract. At the mention of her name Hashirama finally seemed to break from his stupor, looking up at Naruto with a sparkle of excitement in his eye. Little Tsunade-chan. Naruto blinked as he remembered these were Tsunade's great-grandfather and granduncle he was talking to. Although he had to suppress a small smirk at her being called that way, the blonde Sannin certainly wouldn't have appreciated it. Yes, although she isn't so little anymore. Hashirama just nodded absently with a lilting smile on his face, good memories filling his head and replacing his previously dour thoughts. I had always wondered how she might turn out. I always did spoil her too much, even taught her how to gamble myself. He seemed oddly proud of that fact while the three teens' sweat dropped. I bet she inherited my legendary good luck, it always ran in our family after all. Naruto just nodded with a small look of incredulity. It would appear the Senju luck had dried out before it could make it to Tsunade, but he didn't comment on that. Luckily he was saved as Tobirama coughed into his hand, snapping his brother out of his pleasant memories. Oh right, you wanted to know about where I mastered Senjutsu, right? Naruto just nodded, a little thankful that the tangents seemed to be over for now. It was a small glade deep in the forests of Hai no Kuni. It had been sacred and special to the Senju clan for hundreds of years before even my time. The place was practically saturated with nature chakra, it was perfect for the training in senjutsu. Naruto smiled at that, the place did seem absolutely perfect, especially, wait. Did you say was? Hashirama just nodded sadly while to the side his brother frowned, in fact it was actually more of a scowl. The glade no longer exists, it was burned down during a raid on the nearby Senju hideout. At that Tobirama's scowl deepened. A raid from the Uchiha clan. Hashirama for once seemed uncharacteristically angry with his brother, turning to the younger Senju with a small look of irritation. We don't have time for your irrational dislike of the Uchiha Tobirama, we forgave them when Konoha was formed. Why could you not leave it in the past and move forward like I could? The silver-haired Kage said nothing, choosing to simply cross his arms over his chest, stubbornly causing Hashirama to sigh before turning back to Naruto. Like I said, young one, the place where I trained no longer exists and I'm sure the rest of the High no Kuni forests are far too saturated in my own Mokuden chakra to be of any use, however I can offer you some advice. Naruto perked up at that, it wasn't every day you received advice from a Kage, never mind one that is supposed to be dead. To master senjutsu you must have both large chakra reserves to properly balance the nature chakra with. At that Tobirama gently knelt down, touching the ground with two outstretched fingers before looking back up at the group. That should be no trouble for you three, two of you are Jinchuriki after all. He looked specifically at Naruto, Fu and Tayuya, and for once the mint-haired teen let some shock show on her face. The sensory abilities of the Nadaime were really as strong as the history books said. Hashirama just waved his brother off, the advice wasn't concerning that. In any case you must learn to be perfectly still when you allow nature chakra into your body. The way I did this was thanks to a cave in the grove I trained in. There were many stalagmites that I used to balance a small square stone to sit on, this was how I learned to be still. Tobirama smirked at that, he had many memories of watching his older brother fall off of those very same stalagmites. However, the smirk dropped when he noticed parts of his body beginning to turn an ashen gray, flecking away from him like paper being torn from a sheet. Brother, it seems like the chakra sustaining these bodies is finally beginning to run out. We don't have much time. Hashirama just smiled as parts of his hands also began to flake away. That is fine, I have seen for myself the will of fire runs strong in both these children and in the will of your successor. Konoha will survive and hopefully the world will find its peace. Naruto was surprised, the thought of what to do with the two Kage once he had gotten the information hadn't crossed his mind. I thought the Edo Tensei provided you with infinite chakra. That was what Orochimaru had said, immortal soldiers with infinite chakra. Tobirama just smirked as more of his body began to float away like so much ash from a dying fire. The connection with the summoner was cut the moment you removed the seals, the supply of chakra stopped then. The silver-haired Kage turned to Fu as the entirety of his left arm crumbled away, his entire body having taken on an ashen, pale hue. You, Taki girl, I feel you will be strong in the future, continue to grow stronger for the right reasons and carry on my will. Fu seemed a little surprised at being addressed by the famous man but didn't even have time to nod before the rest of his body vanished in a swirl of ash and dust, that confident smirk never once leaving his face. Hashirama passed a few moments later after giving the assembled teens a warm smile, his last words floating in the breeze. Tell Tsunade-chan that I love her. And with that, two of the most powerful men to have ever lived were gone once again, their souls returning to the pure world once again. Well shit. One again. Naruto thought that Tayuya's crass statement summed up the whole situation rather nicely. Naruto sighed contentedly as the gentle sounds of his own footsteps echoed quietly through the hallways of his seal. This place had been a horrible mess after the Gobi had been sealed into him against his will, but it had mostly cleared up since then. His recovery with Fu's help had worked towards that effort. In the past few weeks of traveling he had plenty of opportunities to visit his tenants, something Shukaku had appreciated greatly. However, today he walked into the enormous room that contained his tenants only to come across one large barred door. He had discovered that he could talk with each of his tenants separately should he so choose a few weeks ago, not that he had ever really felt the need to. He supposed it would be nice to talk with Matabi, the most helpful of the Biju, without the Kyuubi glaring at them from across the room. It often made her less cooperative with that unspoken threat hanging over them. Then again, that would only work to undo all the effort Naruto had put into slowly gaining the Great Fox's tenuous trust, what little of it he could anyway. So you have singled me out, should I feel honored, O great sage? Naruto sighed with a small, humored smirk passing over his lips as he took his usual seat at the center of the enormous room. The Kyuubi shifted from within the shadows of his cell, getting up and slinking closer to the bars before lying back down, head rested comfortably on his paws as he left one giant eye open to gaze steadily at the blonde. In the absence of any real malice, the Kyuubi had taken to passive-aggressively shooting Naruto with snide or sarcastic barbs, managing to make them sound malicious anyway with his deep, rumbling voice. I simply wanted to talk with you. The Kyuubi made no outward motion that he cared in the least, even if he was glad that he didn't have the clamorous voices of his fellow Biju making his ears twitch in annoyance. Then talk Rinnegan and be gone. Naruto just nodded. It was nice having the Kyuubi at least tolerate his presence. A year ago and he wouldn't have even had that much. I wanted to know about the sage. At that the Kyuubi's long, almost rabbit-like ear twitched ever so slightly, not that Naruto's eyes missed a thing. Have we not had this conversation before, Rinnegan? I have told you of the sage before, now be gone and take your pointless questions with you. Naruto shook his head slowly. The Kyuubi had told him of the sage's life in passing relation to his own, but that wasn't what Naruto wanted to know. No, I wish to know about the sage himself. What he was like, who he really was. The Kyuubi was silent for a few moments as his large red eye calmly stared into Naruto's ringed ones, the eyes that reminded him so much of his father that he couldn't help but be reminded of the man every time he looked at this mere child of a human. What brought this, Rinnegan? Wish to make more comparisons between yourself and the man to inflate your pathetic ego. Naruto just shook his head again, a soft smile on his face. It always irritated the fox how easily Naruto was able to ignore his insults. No, meeting with the Nidaime and Shodai Hokage showed me that time twists the lives of legendary figures. If stories of the personality of the Shodai were changed so much even in a century, I can only imagine how much was lost in the millennia since the sage's time. He had always imagined the sage as some impossibly wise, strong man who was unwavering in his resolve. However, his eyes had been opened by Hashirama. He had made it painfully obvious that even the legendary figures of the past were simply human, with their own weaknesses and oddities. The sage was strong. Naruto just looked at the Kyuubi expectantly as the fox stared back at him, just as unwavering. However, the Biju finally broke the gaze as he huffed, sending a wall of warm air to rush over the smaller blonde. I do not understand your question. The sage was the sage, he was who he was. Naruto just raised a brow at the circular logic. He couldn't tell if the Kyuubi was avoiding the question or genuinely didn't comprehend it. What was his name? The Kyuubi snorted again, louder this time as he fully turned to Naruto, his large red eyes boring into the young monk. If I will not tell you my own name, why would I tell you his? Naruto just shrugged with that same serene smile on his face. He was too used to the fox to be intimidated by such a glare. Then why not tell me your name? The Kyuubi's eyes narrowed slightly. Your attempts at humor are pointless. Naruto just shrugged again, irritating the large fox to no end. What is your real purpose in coming here, Rinnegan? Naruto met the Biju's steady gaze with an unwavering one of his own. It's like I said, I want to know more about the sage. I should understand the man whose eyes I possess. He had sons, did he not? That meant he had family, a wife. Naruto blinked, remembering some of what he had heard from that time period, wives. The Kyuubi snorted at that, however this time in amusement, even if it was only slight. The sage was far too humble to have more than one wife. That woman he was with was too fierce to allow another anyway. The words left the great fox's mouth before he even realized what he was saying, however he quickly caught himself, glaring down at the blonde. Naruto just smiled warmly. It always made him feel good when he tricked the fox into revealing something. Was that so hard? The Kyuubi merely continued to glare at the boy, a low growl emanating from his throat. What will it take for you to leave me in peace, Rinnegan? Naruto would have blinked in surprise if that wouldn't be showing weakness before the Kyuubi. Instead he looked up in thought, considering the offer. Just the name, that's all. The fox's eyes narrowed dangerously again, however after a tense few moments he let out a long and clearly irritated sigh, resting his head back down on his paws. Otsutsuki Hagoromo, that was the name of the sage. That was the name of my father and the one Rinnegan I could respect. The fox stood back up, rearing up to his full height as he peered down at the blonde. Naruto could have sworn the Kyuubi kept getting bigger every time he came into the seal. Now leave. Naruto was tempted to press his luck a little further, but in the end he decided against it, slowly fading from sight as he returned to consciousness. The Kyuubi simply stared at the spot the blonde had been in for a few more moments before slinking off back into the darkness, wondering what questions Naruto would bring with him next time.